At a certain point, many people wake up to a peculiar kind of suffering. You're sitting in a meeting, nodding along, saying the things you're supposed to say, and somewhere deep in your chest there's a tightness, a pulling sensation, like a rope being slowly twisted. You smile at the right moments. You laugh when others laugh. You make the decisions that look good on paper, that make sense to everyone around you. But inside, there's a voice, quiet at first, then growing louder, whispering that this isn't right, that you're somehow betraying something fundamental about who you are. You go home and the feeling follows you. You look at your life from the outside, and it looks fine, maybe even good. But from the inside, it feels like wearing someone else's skin. And naturally, you become anxious, restless, even depressed. You think, I've lost touch with my true self, or I need to find out who I really am, or I'm living a lie. The guilt is profound. You feel like you're committing some kind of spiritual fraud, day after day, choice after choice. But what if I told you that this very feeling, this sense of betraying your inner truth, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding about what you are? You see, most of what we call the search for authenticity is actually a desperate attempt to find something solid to stand on. We imagine there's some core self inside us, some essential truth about who we really are, and that our job is to discover it and then live according to it. This is what almost everyone assumes when they talk about being true to yourself. They picture it like an archaeological dig. If you just remove enough layers of conditioning, social pressure, and false beliefs, you'll finally uncover the real you underneath. And once you find it, the thinking goes, you'll know exactly what to do. Your choices will become clear. The anxiety will dissolve. You'll finally feel at home in your own life. This is what Heidegger was pointing out when he talked about authenticity and what he called das Man, the anonymous they, the impersonal public self that we all slip into. He saw that most people live their lives according to what one does. One goes to college, one gets a job, one settles down, one has opinions about politics and art and morality that are basically borrowed from the crowd. And Heidegger wasn't being judgmental about this. He understood that it's the default mode of human existence. We're thrown into a world that's already interpreted for us, already full of meanings and expectations and paths. But here's what most people miss when they read Heidegger. Authenticity isn't about finding some pre-existing true self. It's something far more unsettling than that. It's like this. Imagine you're an actor who's been playing the same role for so long that you've started to believe the character is who you really are. You've memorized the lines, internalized the motivations, adopted the mannerisms. The role fits like a glove. But one day, you're backstage, and you catch a glimpse of yourself in the mirror. And for just a moment, you see through the costume, the makeup, the whole performance. And your first instinct is panic. Who am I if I'm not this character? So you do what seems natural. You try to find your true role, the part you were meant to play all along. You audition for different characters, trying each one on, hoping one of them will finally feel right. But here's the thing you're not seeing. You're not any of the characters. You're not even really an actor with some fixed identity. You're more like the act of performing itself, constantly taking shape, never finished, always in motion. Once you see this pattern, everything changes. That feeling of betrayal you've been carrying around, the sense that you're somehow being false to yourself, starts to look different. Because what you're actually experiencing isn't the betrayal of some inner truth. It's the anxiety of freedom. It's the vertigo of realizing that there is no script, no essence, no true self waiting to be discovered. There's only you, here, now, choosing again and again in a situation you didn't ask for and can't fully control. Let me give you an analogy that might help. Think about what happens when you're desperately hungry and you finally eat. The food doesn't just satisfy some abstract concept of hunger, it meets a real physical need in your body. Now imagine someone who's never actually been hungry, who's always eaten on schedule, 3 meals a day, whether they needed food or not. They might develop all sorts of theories about what they should eat, complex rules about nutrition and timing and portion size. But they're operating entirely in their heads. They've never actually felt their body's genuine need, so they don't know the difference between real hunger and the anxiety of not following their food rules. This is what's happening when you're trying to live according to your inner truth. You're treating authenticity like it's a set of rules, or preferences or values that you need to discover and then obey. But authentic existence, what Heidegger called it, isn't about following some inner compass. It's about recognizing that you're the one holding the compass, turning it this way and that, and there's no magnetic north for it to point to except the choices you're making right now. The betrayal you feel isn't that you're going against your true nature. It's that you're finally becoming aware of something you've been avoiding, your absolute freedom, and the absolute responsibility that comes with it. And this period, this awakening to your own freedom, can last quite a while. It's deeply uncomfortable, because you've spent your whole life thinking in terms of finding yourself, being true to yourself, expressing yourself, all language that assumes there's a self there to be found, to be true to express. And now you're starting to suspect that this whole framework is the problem. But you don't have a new framework yet. You're in between. And in this between place, every choice feels impossibly heavy. Should you stay in this relationship or leave? Should you keep this job or quit? Should you move to a new city or stay where you are? And the usual way you'd answer these questions, by asking, "What does my true self want?" no longer works, because you're beginning to see through that whole way of thinking. The usual response is to try desperately to reconstruct some sense of certainty. You might turn to personality tests, astrology, therapy, spiritual teachings, anything that promises to tell you who you really are. You might make dramatic changes in your life, thinking that if you just rearrange the external circumstances enough, you'll finally feel authentic. You might dive deep into introspection, journaling for hours, meditating, analyzing your childhood, your dreams, your patterns. And none of this is wrong, exactly. But this doesn't work because you're still operating from the assumption that there's something to find. You're still looking for that solid ground, that essential self, that inner truth. And the more desperately you search for it, the more anxious you become. Because on some level, you're starting to suspect it isn't there. I must warn you about something. What I'm describing here isn't a comfortable realization. It doesn't feel like coming home. It feels more like being homeless. And you might think this sounds rather nihilistic, like I'm saying nothing matters. You're just making it all up. There's no real you at all. And you're right to be concerned. It's not some liberating spiritual awakening where suddenly everything becomes light and easy. Heidegger understood this. He knew that authentic existence involves facing what he called being toward death, the recognition of your own finitude, your own most possibility that cannot be shared or avoided. And this recognition isn't peaceful. It's characterized by anxiety, what he called angst, which is different from fear. Fear has an object. You're afraid of something specific. Anxiety doesn't. It's the feeling of the ground dropping out from under you when you realize there is no ground. Now, you might think this sounds rather bleak, like you've lost something precious, that sense of having an inner truth to guide you. And in a way, you have. You've lost a comforting fiction. But here's what you haven't lost: yourself. You can't lose what you never had in the way you thought you had it. What you're discovering is that you're not a thing at all. You're not an object with properties and a fixed nature. You're more like a verb than a noun. You're the ongoing event of existing, of taking a stand on your own being, of finding yourself always already in situations where you have to choose, to act, to be something without any guarantee that it's the right thing. Let me tell you about someone I knew. He was a lawyer, successful by every conventional measure, but he'd spent years feeling like he was living someone else's life. He'd gone into law because it seemed like the responsible choice, because his family valued stability and respect, because it made sense. But he'd always felt this nagging sense that his real passion was something else. Maybe art, maybe teaching, maybe something he couldn't even name. He spent years in therapy trying to figure out what he really wanted. He took personality tests. He made lists of his values. He read books about finding your purpose. And the more he searched for his true self, the more fragmented he felt, because every answer he found seemed to contradict some other answer. Then something happened. Not a dramatic event, just a slow accumulation of small moments where he started to notice something. He was sitting in his office one afternoon, working on a case, and he realized he was actually interested in what he was doing. Not because it matched some inner essence of who he was, but just because, in that moment, working on that problem, he was engaged. And then, later that week, he was in a museum, looking at a painting, and he was equally engaged there. Neither experience was more authentic than the other. He wasn't being true to himself in one and false in the other. He was just being fully in each moment. One day he was having coffee with a friend who asked him, "So, are you going to quit law and do what you really want?" And he realized the question didn't make sense anymore. Not because he'd decided to settle or compromise, but because he'd stopped believing in the framework the question assumed. There was no what he really wanted separate from what he was actually doing and experiencing. He wasn't an inner truth being betrayed by outer circumstances. He was the whole thing. The lawyer who sometimes felt fulfilled and sometimes didn't. The museum visitor, the friend drinking coffee, the anxiety, the engagement, all of it. There was no authentic core being betrayed. There was just this ongoing event of being him, which included the anxiety about authenticity itself. What he understood, gradually, was that the feeling of betraying himself wasn't a signal that he was doing the wrong thing. It was the anxiety of freedom, of having to choose without any ultimate ground for the choice, and then having to own that choice, to be responsible for it without being able to blame it on his true nature, or his authentic self, or anything else. And this wasn't a comfortable realization. It was actually more demanding than the old framework, because now he couldn't hide behind the excuse of, "This isn't really me," or "I'm just doing this until I find what I really want to do." He had to own all of it. The lawyering he chose to continue, the art he chose to pursue in his free time, the relationships he chose to maintain or end. All of it was him, not because it matched some inner truth, but because these were his choices, and choosing is what he was. So what do you do in the meantime, while you're in this uncomfortable space between the old understanding and whatever comes next? You live. You make choices. You go to work. You have conversations. You make dinner. And you do these things without the expectation that they'll reveal your true self or prove your authenticity. You do them because they're what's in front of you, what the situation calls for, what seems worth doing in this particular moment. Not because they're right in some absolute sense, but because you're choosing them, and the choosing itself is what you are. And you watch. You observe how the anxiety about authenticity actually functions in your experience. You notice how it arises when you're about to make a choice, how it feels like something's warning you that you're about to betray yourself. But instead of taking this feeling as information about your true nature, you recognize it for what it is: the vertigo of freedom, the discomfort of having to choose without any ultimate justification. And you make the choice anyway. Not by overriding the anxiety, but by including it, by choosing while anxious, by being authentic not to some inner truth, but to the actual situation you're in, which includes your anxiety and your uncertainty and everything else. And most importantly, you stop comparing. You stop comparing your current experience to some imagined state of perfect authenticity. You stop comparing yourself to other people who seem to have it all figured out, who seem to know who they are and what they want. You stop comparing your present choices to what you think you would choose if you were really being true to yourself. Because all of these comparisons assume there's some standard to measure against, some true north that you're deviating from. And once you see that there is no such standard, that you're making it up as you go along, not in a frivolous way, but in the deepest sense that your being is nothing but this ongoing choosing, then the comparisons lose their grip. Paradoxically, it's only when you stop trying to be authentic that you become it. Because authenticity, in Heidegger's sense, isn't about matching your life to some inner template. It's about owning your existence, taking responsibility for the fact that you're the one who has to choose, to interpret your situation, to give meaning to your life. It's about recognizing that you're thrown into circumstances you didn't choose: your body, your time in history, your culture, your starting conditions, but that how you take up these circumstances, how you project yourself into possibilities, how you make something of what's been made of you, this is yours. This is freedom. And it's terrifying, because there's no one else to blame, no essential nature to fall back on, no true self that guarantees you're on the right path. Perhaps the reason you feel like you're betraying your inner truth is that you've outgrown the need for one. Not because you're better or more evolved than people who still believe in that framework, but because you've encountered enough of your own freedom that you can't pretend anymore that you're just discovering who you are, rather than creating who you are with every choice. And this encounter with freedom is what throws you back on yourself in the most fundamental way. Not on some inner truth, but on the bare fact that you exist, that you have to exist in one way or another, that choosing is not optional. And it's not nothing. It's not some empty relativism where nothing matters and all choices are equal. It's the weight of mattering itself, without any external validation or internal essence to lighten the load. Your choices matter because they're your choices. Your life means something because you're the one giving it meaning, not discovering a meaning that was already there. You're responsible not to some inner truth, but to the actual effects of your choices, to the people affected by them, to the possibilities you're opening or closing. You just forgot for a while. You forgot that you were never meant to discover yourself. You were meant to create yourself, to take up your existence and make something of it, knowing full well that what you make isn't guaranteed to be right, or good, or authentic in any absolute sense, but that it's yours. And that's enough. The betrayal you've been feeling isn't that you're going against your nature. It's that you're finally facing your nature, which is to have no fixed nature, to be thrown into existence and tasked with the burden of being free. Walk through that doorway, not by trying to walk, but by recognizing you've been standing in it all along.